Let no one say the past is dead. The past is all around us and within. So said Kath Walker, later known as Oodgeroo Noonuccal, in her poem, written on her home island of Minjerribah, Stradbroke Island in Moreton Bay. It's worth applying this understanding to our time together right now because we fill a special place here. It's exactly 200 years and almost a month since the British government established this penal colony called Moreton Bay. So I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which we gather, the Turrbal on this side of the river, the Jagera on the other side of the river, and I honour the elders past, present and emerging. Thank you all for attending, and a special thanks to Stephen Moriarty, who's sitting in the front, whose short collage of films gathered from different police images, historic ones, was playing while you were seated. Yes, the British first established a military bastion at Redcliffe, a small peninsula butting into Moreton Bay in September 1824, then relocated here along this low ridge, which is now what we know as William Street. They did that in May 1825 following John Oxley's trip up this river and his recommendation the settlement move. So the stone walls in which we sit today were actually built by convicts under military rule. And for these imprisoned labourers, Moreton Bay was a place of terror, as it was for the Turrbal and Jagera when they started to defend their lands against the invaders. So fast forward to 1924, when Queensland celebrated its centenary. To the growingly confident state of Queensland, it seemed so long ago that Britain had established its colonial penal settlement far to the north of its Sydney epicentre. In 1924, smug in its white Australia identity, Brisbane marked the milestone with celebrations, glossing over facts that it's found a little embarrassing, such as that it had been a penal colony in the beginning, and the role of the Australian frontier wars, which were particularly bloody in Queensland. The stallion libertine that you see here could well have been an example of the kinds of horses that were used to celebrate that centenary in 1924. And the Aboriginal workers I'm introducing you to from the Rewan horse breeding station in the Central Highlands were the kinds of horses that were supplied for such celebrations, as well as the horses that they supplied to police stations all throughout Queensland, except in the deep north where the terrain was so rugged that special horses were needed, sturdy little horses like the Whaler. In 1927, we have a record of the horses from Rewan being used when the Duke of York, Prince Albert, the future King George VI, representing his father, King George V, visited Queensland after he opened the new building to house the Australian Parliament in Canberra. Rewan bred horses form part of the regal escort, and the Prince praised their symmetry and tractability. Both the Governor-General of Australia and the Governor of Queensland added their highest terms of praise, and they all acknowledged the standard of excellence in the Rewan bred horses. By that year, 1927, the stud had been operating for 18 years. The horse handler you see pictured is an Aboriginal man, and he stands outside the photographer's frame, which might prompt you to inquire, is this the way the Queensland government treated its Indigenous workers? Are they always outside the frame? The government established its horse stud in the Central Highlands on 78,000 acres in 1909 on what was known to be excellent grazing country. It did so to save money, to supply its own horses for transport to police officers. Buying them was very expensive. Police sent a white constable and 2 Aboriginal men employed under the name of trackers up with a mob of horses from southeast Queensland. They took them via Roma. This horse handler is probably the one called Rob. The other was a man called Paddy. They brought with them their wives. On either side of the handler and horse are 2 buildings that you saw, one for the manager John Campbell and his family, the other for visits by Brisbane government men, police commissioners, chief inspectors, members of parliament, and they were built in 1911. Nice, sturdy, wood and tin constructs. The cottage on your right still stands and it is protected as the Commissioner's Cottage, and it's on the Queensland Heritage Register, as are 2 other buildings that you will see. This is where Rob lived. All buildings on Rewan Station were called quarters. The area for the Aboriginal workers was called the Blacks Camp down the creek. Sorry. In the years that followed the arrival of the initial herd, most transport was by railway from Brisbane to Rockhampton and from Rockhampton to Springshaw. Springshaw was the business centre. Rewan Station was isolated near Carnarvon Gorge. Who's been to Carnarvon Gorge, by the way? Great. That is the place to visualise while I'm giving this talk. To get to Rewan from Springshaw was by dirt track, and you went through the village of Rolleston on the Brown and later the Comet River. A lecture or talk such as this can really only sketch the basics of the dynamics between the Queensland government as an employer and the Aboriginal workforce of 25 years. Despite the small number of references to the workers in police department records, which are now deposited with the Queensland State Archives, the story I initially started to write outgrew the size of an article and turned into a book. Queensland does lack, unfortunately, a focused history of police trackers in the 20th century, such as Michael Bennett's Pathfinders, A History of Aboriginal Trackers in New South Wales in 2020. I do believe it's quite urgent that Queensland does get a history of trackers employed by the Queensland government, because Rewan Station that I'll talk about today was an unusual place, and the trackers there were not necessarily typical of the whole state of Queensland. I will argue that they were in a much more privileged position than most of them, and I think it's time we in Queensland actually knew what the government was doing with its own employees. Luckily, in terms of the government, we do have government records, patchy as they are. They are still able to provide a history. Rob had a past. He'd had removal orders from Cooktown in 1902 when the government was using missions nearby as reserves or internment camps for Aboriginal people from all over the eastern side of Cape York. Documentation for the other tracker, Paddy, has proved elusive, but removal and displacement from country was the norm. So Paddy had probably been subject to removal orders too. The mechanism for controlling Aboriginal people in the 20th century was removal orders, and I'll have a picture of one of those pieces of paper later. Those orders put the workers into, the Aboriginal people into reserves and settlements, and therefore they then became inmates. From there, workers were encouraged to go to workplaces for lower wages than white workers, under very strict controls. This photograph seems to show one such group on their way to a mission. It's not meant to represent Rob or his wife and children who did join him in Rewan, who did join him later, but just to show the kinds of faces people had when they were most likely on their way to one of the reserves or missions. The Chief Protector of Aboriginal's office operated in tandem with the Home Secretary's office and had an office adjacent to the Home Secretary in the Executive Building, popularly known as the Treasury Building. Yes, we sit just a few blocks away. The Aboriginal reserves and settlements were labour bureaus that supplied goods in the form of black workers to the government and private enterprise alike. Baramba and later called Cherbourg settlement supplied workers to Queensland Police from 1905. The superintendents of the settlements kept an eye out for the most desirable recruits, especially those who would suit the needs of Queensland Police. Because the Rewan horse stud was so dear to his heart, Police Commissioner Cahill plainly smoothed the path to ensure that the very best of appropriate workers, black trackers and white constables alike, staffed Rewan Station, even though there was a general shortage of police throughout the state. Queensland Police did not initially recruit locals, that is the Garranwell and Bidgera locals, to Rewan Stud Farm, but transferred workers from other police stations after they proved their worth. They had to prove their worth as horse handlers. And if you were any good on a horse, then you were, your boss in your local police station would tell his boss, who would eventually tell the police commissioner, who would let the Home Secretary and the Chief Protector of Aboriginals know, because that meant you were in demand. So here is a picture of Campbell and the missus. So with many people, Aboriginal people working on all sorts of farms throughout the state, the ones who worked on Rewan were a little bit different because their boss was John Campbell. He was a police officer because this was a police operation, and so he was very much part of the police hierarchy of command. So he was not only the boss of the white stockmen who were sworn in as constables, but he was also very much the boss of the black workers. But the white constables were also in charge of the black workers. So despite their long experience on the station, there was never ever a promotion of a black worker who was very highly experienced to run operations. They were always under the control of a white constable or the big boss, Campbell, as they called him, the boss. Now, Campbell's wife, Eliza, was unofficially in charge of the women. The wives, many of the trackers did bring their wives with them. For 25 years, the Aboriginal women on Rewan Station were unnamed in police records except for one or two tiny examples. But they nevertheless formed a pool of domestic labour to help on the station, unpaid. The language that the government used about its labour needs portrays its sheer acquisitiveness. There's a file that shows this called The Pay of Trackers and Corporals, 1866 to 1937, and you'll see that in the Queensland State Archives. Here's some of the words I found, sprinkled throughout that file. Trackers were required, wanted, supplied, sent, dispatched, delivered, obtained, retained. Besides the language of supply, police commissioners made constant commentary on the kind of recruit they needed. Tracker work demanded, quote, the most intelligent and smartest boys. First-class hands. They were scrutinised and their performance was rated. Tracker X might be said to be a good worker. Tracker Y, he was a good boy. If a labourer failed to meet a police station's expectations, the officer in charge informed the police commissioner, who dealt with him. He might discharge the failed tracker, dispense with him. If a tracker deserted, and desertion happened in the rest of Queensland by trackers rather a lot, but not on Rewan, he would order that runaway employee to be deported, moved. However, the workforce on Rewan was really quite stable, and the reasons will become apparent if you read the book, Know Their Names. The trackers on Rewan were usually better fed. They lived in isolation under the protection of the police command, and so they were safer for removal, and they could live in peace with their families. That's the reasons I think that there was a stable workforce. Somewhere around 1912 to 1914, a photographer shot an intriguing series of photographs that are held in the John Oxley Library under the title Aboriginal People, Rewan Station. Members of the Rewan Aboriginal community were dressed and opened up as if for a corroboree performance. Mock Battle, one of those photos, shows an actual reenactment of the Australian Frontier Wars. A local man called Prince Albert may have joined as early as 1910, just a year or so after the establishment of the stud farm. Campbell increasingly recruited skilled Central Highland stockmen, probably because their local knowledge and renown made them far too valuable to overlook. Prince came from a neighbouring station called Consuelo, and he brought with him Myra Freeman and her children. Around this time, a cattle herd was added to the station by the government, and these beasts were destined for the meatworks from staple trees, usually sent to Northampton, and Prince was an expert with cattle. In the early days of the station, the Police Commissioner Cahill reported breeding tallies to the Queensland Governor and the Parliament. Between 1909 and 1912, the Shawfoal getter Libertine, who you saw earlier, had sired 139 foals. Bonnie Boy, another stallion, had sired 56. So the workers took broken-in horses sired by these stallions to railheads to distribute them to police stations. Roma in the south and Springshaw in central Queensland for the central stations. And Myra seems to have been a Wodja woman. She was Prince's partner on Rewan Station for many years. My guess would be 13. And yet Campbell never once named her in his police correspondence. She was simply noted as Jin, who was obliged to give rations to. A painting of an Aboriginal mother in the Central Highlands from near the end of the colonial period by the Swedish artist Fritzson can remind us of the challenges that mothers faced. In the wake of the Australian Frontier Wars, the displacement from country to fringe dweller camps, such as those near Ralston and Springshaw, the lack of hunting and gathering opportunities due to displacement, the advent of infectious diseases from TB to influenza to leprosy, premature deaths, all mounted to a community experiencing extreme trauma, both physical and emotional. Another worker who joined the Rewan staff due to removal orders was Splinter from North Queensland's Gulf Country. He was removed from Mitchell River Mission on the western side of Cape York in early 1911. He was taken by lugger to Thursday Island and by ship to Brisbane, then detained on Baramba or Cherbourg settlement. Like Tracker Rob, he has a really, really big story, and I do cover that in the book. In late 1914, Splinter agreed to work on this horse breeding station. So the superintendent of Baramba supplied clothing to Splinter and a dress for his wife Nellie. I quote from his correspondence to the Chief Protector just to give you a taste of the language used at the time. The superintendent wrote, "I am giving Splinter ES, elastic-sided boots, trousers and hat, and for his gin, dress and hat. You might kindly cause some of his wages to be remitted to me for months to liquidate this debt." The couple left for Rewan Station on the 11th of November 1914, with the superintendent therefore working on clawing back some of the cost of their clothes. The whole stolen wages issue in relation to these particular workers has not been examined by anybody, as far as I'm aware, and it really would be worthwhile researching. I estimate Splinter's age when he got to Rewan Station about 20, in the prime of his life. He stayed for something like 20 years. Workers like Splinter and Nellie, another woman, Splinter's wife, whose name never ever appears in the police records, likely left Baramba by train. They went north to Rocky, out to Springshaw, and during his years on Rewan Station, he would have seen a great deal of that particular railway station, because this is where the workers loaded the horses that had been broken in, as well as the cattle for the meatworks. And if the stud had bought a stud animal, a nice Hereford bull or whatever, that's where they unloaded that animal and took it down to Rewan Station. So there's been a little bit of a breakthrough in terms of the resources around, and that is that a descendant has come forward with a whole bunch of photographs, in addition to some of the ones I've already found in the John Oxley Library. The sort of exciting things that happens to a historian, and it was just simply too late to put it in the book. They just arrived as the book was actually being printed on the north side of Brisbane. So I'm really looking forward to these particular images. There's about 40 of them going into the State Library and becoming available. They'll be of particular importance to Bidgera and Baringal people's descendants. So this is one of them. It's thought that Splinter might be the one on the right. So who took these photos? What we've just found out is that it was actually Adam Locke, who was in charge of the Rolleston Police Station from 1908 to the 1920s. The photos I showed earlier can be attributed to him too. So Locke's family is still different descendants through Rolleston, and the young descendant who approached me had actually image matched the image from the invitation to this World Historical event, found that horse, Libertine, and matched it to his descendant, his ancestors' photos. And so thank goodness for, matching on the internet. And so there's now 40 photos instead of just the 5 or so that had found their way somehow to the Emerald Library and then to the John Oxley Library, all of which were just not attributed properly and not even probably named properly. So I found that even if my book produces this one thing, I think it's really been worth it for me. So here's the Rewan Meat House. It was very important on Rewan. The government as a whole decreed the amount of food that was sufficient to keep tracker employees alive throughout the whole state. Tea, flour, beef, jam and sugar were the staples. In fact, it decreed the ration minimums for Aboriginal people throughout the state. But Rewan, of course, was the only police station in Queensland with a meat house, because it was not actually a police station, it was a pastoral station, or ranch, as Americans might say. The constables were catered for in the station house, but we have to picture the Aboriginal workers lining up for their weekly rations here. The meat house is also on the Queensland Heritage Register, and here I'd like to mention a special guest today, and that is Tom Marn, who's sitting in the front row here. Tom's ancestor Daniel, whose photo I'll show shortly, was a worker on Rewan Station just before the 20s. And it's thanks to Tom that some of the buildings that exist here, oh, there's the photo already, have been preserved as Queensland heritage. So, yeah, Tom, you're a bit of a hero. We're all going to give you a clap. And Tom lives at the Sunshine Coast, and I think a little over 80, Tom, so I really appreciate that you came all the way down here. Oh, 89. No, oh, tell us, Tom.
90.
He's 90, sorry, he's 90. So we're going to give you another clap. Thank you so much for coming down, Tom. Tom was really helpful for me as I started this research in the days when I thought I was just going to write a short article. So a couple of years after the meat house was built, a long-serving corporal, Corporal Rob, died in the early 1920s. There's no record of why he died or what cause. There's no marker of his burial. He is buried there at Rewan Station. Paddy had come and gone without any records that I could find about when he left. And another tracker called Peter Stanley had left due to injuries in 1914. That's all we know about Peter Stanley, except that the police commissioner did describe him as an exceptionally good boy. So white constables were expected to stay for 3 years, but few did. The answer for Campbell and the Queensland Police was to employ more local Aboriginal people. By 1920, Bulbara Freeman, who'd grown up in Consuelo, then with his mother, Rewan they call it, with his mother Myra, was at least 21 years old, and he was then put onto the staff. So I've only got 5 minutes to go. So it's very different talking to a live audience to doing 30 minutes at home and rabbit. So I'm actually probably going to just put my script aside and just talk to the slides really briefly. So you can see with this particular picture, the Aboriginal community was really large. And this is an example of the removal orders that an Aboriginal person would be issued with. So they were still in operation at the time of these workers. I'd like to mention here that there was a huge amount of removals going on in the Rolleston and Springshaw area a little later than many other places. So that happened in about 1923. So another thing that the descendant who called me recently about the photos taken by his ancestor said was his grandmother always spoke about the shrieking, the crying, the wailing that she heard herself in Rolleston when the Aboriginal people from that area were being rounded up into cattle trucks and taken to, at that time, Taroom settlement, which was in the south. Later they were taken to Warrabinda. So I'm going to just zip through these. This is the Rolleston Police Station, and it was very important for the workers because the government built a special little shed out the back so that they could sleep there on their way with these huge cattle mobs as they moved hundreds of cattle mobs up to Springshaw Station to put on the cattle trucks. And they also would camp there if they were taking up horses to put on the trains. Another place that's really quite important for the workers, and again, I would have liked to have gone into more detail here, but I've run out of time. I do detail it in the book how trackers throughout the state were encouraged to go to the races for their leave and to shows. And we have a lot of examples of how the Aboriginal workers on Rewan Station were given leave to go to the Springshaw races. So you do notice in that picture that they're not visible, but they were there. This is a lovely little photo that was in a book called Yahweh Bungie, one of the few memoirs that comes from the Central Highlands. And the man on the right is thought to be Splinter, now in his mid-40s, and not quite sure about the identities. It's really hard to tell. There was no identities except Splinter's noted. But it gives you an idea. This is not even the whole camp. This is just some of the people who weren't part of the official trackers' families. It does give us an idea of the number of people who were on the station. Aboriginal people did outnumber the white people all the time. So, due to all kinds of interesting things, which I haven't got time to go into, but Campbell was actually charged with taxation fraud, and he was dismissed. It coincided with the time when the government realised that horses were no longer the mode of transport for the police, and they would be moving to motor cars far more. And of course, in Brisbane, they were using motor cars, but they weren't throughout most of Queensland. But anyway, they decided to close Rewent Station. And it's really interesting that the Queensland Police Union played quite a role in that. They were agitating all the time for the station to be closed. They wanted cars, they didn't want horses, and they put cartoons in their journal decrying the ridiculousness of having horses. So it coincided with Police Commissioner Ryan's demise as well. He was under pressure for corruption, particularly from the union, and he actually ended up retiring. And a fellow called Carroll, who was a civilian, was put into place to carry the administration of the police forward. And one of the decisions Carroll made was to, or the decision had already been made to close the station, but Carroll decided that the horses would be sent to Charleville for auction. And before I get on to those photos, this building, which is just across the way, is where the administration of this huge property went back to as the Lands Department. Very key player in Australian, especially Queensland history. So the horses were just not used to trekking. They were pampered animals. They were mostly in the stables. This is also a Queensland Heritage listed building that can be seen if you're going to Canarma Gorge. And the horses were absolutely struggled as they were being pressed to go up over the Carnarvon Range to Charleville for the auction. And again, we see the lack of acknowledgement of the role of the Aboriginal workers, because they're barely mentioned, but they were there doing all this work, trying to save the stallions' lives. And I think one of the most poignant files I ever read in Queensland State Archives was the story of them going, taking the horse herd to Charleville. Eddie Bundle was one of the later stockmen, and he was mentioned. In passing, the Charleville police officer who had to write a report to the Police Commissioner, Carroll, said they'd all done wonderfully well, except he didn't use the word all. He used the word the constables did wonderfully well. But again, I saw again and again how the Aboriginal workers' role had been written out of history. So it's very hard to write them back in when there's very little documentation. I mean, a historian has to have documentation and sources. So I did rely a lot on the memoirs that existed around the time.
Yeah.
I think it's nearly time for question and answer, so I'll just go to my wrap up. So to return to the present day, and Ujaru's words, let no one say that the past is dead. The past is all around us and within. Let's really think about that. On this building's doorstep, Star Entertainment, that operates the casino, operated the casino in the Treasury Building from 1995. It vacated in September, just weeks ago. Across the river, the newly established Truth Telling and Healing Inquiry had a ceremonial hearing in the hall of the Convention Centre on the 16th of September to launch its work, and that independent inquiry is currently touring the state to collect testimonies about the impact of colonialism. I do hope some of the descendants of the Rewan workers take the opportunity to tell their stories. And here, in this very place, the Royal Historical Society will hold the Moreton Bay Settlement Conference in these convict-built walls to commemorate the founding of British settlement next year, in 200 years since 1825. This was built, I think, in 1827. But thank you again very much. You've been a wonderful audience, so attentive. I really appreciate that. And I'd just like to say that listening is a very important part of knowing and understanding. And I again thank Stephen Moriarty for the film that we saw at the very beginning, a collage of Queensland Police images. Thank you.